Today I'm looking at another pair of earphones from Hifiman. These are the RE600s V2, which are a more traditional wired pair of earphones. The RRP for these is £199, which seems a little bit high. However, they're actually selling for somewhere around £60 or $75. Now, full disclosure, I didn't pay for these myself. They were sent over to me by Hifiman for my honest review. And as always, whether I pay for something myself or I get sent something over for review, I'm always going to give you my honest opinion. So let's get into it. Hey guys, it's Noel and this is Wheezy Reviews. And if you're new to this channel, this is where I document my exploration into the world of all things audio. And each week I take a look at something audio related and let you know what I think of it. So make sure you subscribe if you're into that kind of content. And without further ado, let's just get into it. So these are the Hifiman RE600s V2. And they come in this rather impressive leatherette and metal presentation case, they call it. It's lined with this dense foam with cutouts for the earphones themselves and also the tips. Now, whilst this box is rather impressive, this packaging does seem a little bit excessive, but it does contribute to an overall rather premium unboxing experience. Whilst the actual earphones are quite small and light, which makes them disappear into your ears quite nicely, the cable itself, which is unfortunately non-removable in that more traditional earphone style, is not so good. On the one hand, there's this rather nice looking and feeling nylon braided cable up to the Y-splitter. It is a rather stiff braid and it does hold the kinks a little bit. However, the cable from the Y-splitter is rather thin and plasticky feeling and still holds the kinks quite a lot. And unfortunately, this makes the cable rather microphonic when rubbing against clothing, and that was especially noticeable when walking around outside wearing these. Now, the fit of the RE600s V2 is down from the ear rather than over ear. Now, I suppose you could probably invert these and wear them over the ear. Now, I tried this. I never found it to be particularly comfortable, and it just didn't really work for me like that. But when worn with the cable facing down the RE600s V2, they do fit quite snugly into the ear with the cable exit coming out from the notch in your ear. And for me, I actually found these to be one of the more comfortable earphones of this style that I've ever used. However, as I did previously mention, and this is something that I always have a problem with earphones of this style, the downward facing cable exit leads to the cable catching against clothing and tugging on the earpiece. And that leads to the cable being quite microphonic and transmitting the noise of movement directly into your ears. However, because the earpiece itself does fit quite snugly into your ear, I don't find that the cable actually pulls them out as I do with larger earphones of this style. In terms of comfort then, I think this is a bit of a mixed bag. While I appreciate these small earpieces that fit snugly into the ear, the cable does leave me wanting. Whilst there is a market for downward-facing cable exit earphones, the cable, which is quite stiff and microphonic, is a bit of a bummer, and I would much prefer, at this price point, an ear hook design with a removable cable, and also the supplied tips are not particularly special, and I much prefer to use foam tips. And on the subject of tips, I'm going to circle back around to that in a bit. So before we move on to sound, let's just go over the specifications. So the RE600s V2 sport a 1.2 meter single crystalline copper cable, which terminates in a 3.5mm TRS mini jack. The drivers themselves are 8.5mm dynamic drivers. The earphones are also supplied with 11 different silicone tips of various sizes of single and biflange types. You've got 5 pairs of replacement filters to protect the nozzle. And you've also got this weird little cable winder and a basic carrying pouch for the earphones themselves. And the earphones themselves have an impedance of 16 ohms and a sensitivity of 102 dB per milliwatt. And the total weight of these earphones is 13.7 grams. So onto my listening tests. All the listening was done either from my mobile device, which was a OnePlus 6 Android phone, or from my PC through an O2S stack, using a mix of Spotify and FLAC files. Now, whilst I much prefer to use foam tips on any earphone, I use the silicone tips for my listening tests, as Hifiman don't actually supply any foam tips with these. In terms of overall sound signature, these obviously share a similar vibe to the TWS 600 that I reviewed previously. However, they've definitely got a bit more bass and more extension, thus it evens out the sound much better, I think. The TWS 600 has a rather strange sound signature with a significant emphasis on the upper mids and a rolled off, quite considerably rolled off bass and treble. I did find that they worked well for jazz. It wasn't a sound signature that I was particularly a fan of. Now, the RE600 SV2 are a similar upper mid forward sound, but with a bit more bass to beef up the overall sound. Now, these are not quite as shouty as the TWS 600. There is some energy in that upper mid range, but it's not quite to the same level as on the TWS 600. But certainly there is a certain amount of emphasis somewhere between 1 and 2 kilohertz. I think peaking somewhere around 2 kilohertz. And maybe that's the house sound for Hifiman IEMs? I'm not sure on that. Now, bass is much more present on the RE600 than the TWS 600, with a decent amount of extension down into the sub bass. But overall, this is a rather lean and light sound. It has an overall rather neutral presentation, I would say, in the bass and the low mids at least. Upper mids are a little bit forwards, and they probably could be shouty on some tracks. And as I said, there seems to be that energy between 1 and maybe 1 and 2.5 kilohertz actually, with that peak around about 2. And then it sort of comes back down to sort of more neutral levels in the treble, but then really does quite quickly roll off. Now, I do tend to prefer a more rolled off treble on a portable headphone, so I don't actually have any issue with that on a personal level. I prefer a more non-fatiguing sound for a portable headphone. But these are not so rolled off that they have a dark sound signature. They definitely aren't dark. In fact, I would say they have a more of a bright neutral tilt. I generally prefer a much bigger and warmer bass than this, a bit more mid-bass, but I would say probably in the bass to low mids, we're looking at more of an old school neutral than a Harman neutral. Now, my initial impressions suggested that these would probably be pretty good for jazz, much like the TWS 600. However, these would probably have a little bit more body due to that bass not rolling off quite so soon. And these first impressions do seem to be the case, so let me just go through a few examples and talk a bit more detail about the sound. And I'll start out with some jazz. Listening to Charles Mingus, the saxophone is very forwards, and other brass quite forwards and full and creamy quality to them. The bass has much more body than on the TWS 600, but it's just as articulate. On Better Get It In Your Soul, imaging is pretty good. I feel that I'm right in the middle of the band. Perhaps this is more to do with the track than the earphones themselves, as I'm not really hearing anything spectacular elsewhere in terms of imaging. Although staging is really quite intimate and puts me right in the middle of the band on stage. And there is a really good amount of detail and energy with these. On Moanin', there's more of that intimate staging. The saxophone intro is full and round. It's probably a more accurate representation than on the TWS 600, which actually sounded a little bit cold. Now, I previously mentioned that jazz could be a little bit muddy on the T4 comparatively to the TWS 600. I find that jazz is not a genre that works especially well on bass-heavy headphones. That's not to say that the T4 is a bass-heavy headphone, but it is a lot warmer than the TWS 600 and the RE600. Now, I would say that the RE600 gets it just right. It's full and warm enough to have a more complete sound, but not to the point of muddiness and not so rolled off as the TWS 600. And that enables the bass to really play off against the saxophone much better than the TWS 600, whilst keeping the same level of detail and clarity in the low end. Now, switching genres to some rock, and one of my most used examples, Talk Talk by A Perfect Circle. The bass line is detailed and articulate with enough warmth to sound full, but not so much as to sound boosted. On most headphones, the guitar and the drums are probably the most forwards part of the track, and this has a little bit more balance, allowing some more emphasis on Maynard's vocals and some particular focus on the piano that I don't think I've ever heard on any other headphone. Now, the distorted guitar section at 3 minutes and 10 seconds, which I think is a point of pain on some headphones, actually sounded quite restrained and mellow on these, much to my rather pleasant surprise, actually. Never Tell a Soul by Circus Survive is also interesting. The level and detail of instrument separation is really excellent on these. Now, this and most tracks by Circus Survive are a full and large layered sound. Now, on the RE600s, there's less of that fullness and that warmth, but the trade-off is a lot more clarity in the low end. The bass is detailed, but not big. I'm not sure that these really do that track justice in terms of musicality, but in terms of analytical detail, I'm actually quite impressed. Moving on to one of my favorite genres for listening casually whilst I'm out and about, some lo-fi chill hop. The RE600s does seem to have a good deal of sub-bass potential, thus showing that there is actually a good amount of extension on these. The piano is excellent with this full, nice and warm reverb, although I'm finding that the snare and hi-hat is a little bit harsh in places. Rice Wine by Kaleido is an excellent example of how much sub-bass the RE600s V2 is capable of, and a great example of the sustained piano too. But moving back to those snare hits, I think that lo-fi highlights something that I was noticing on some other music, but to a greater extent. Now, lo-fi tracks often use a very snappy snare sound, rather than the full whack of a rock drum kit. Now, whilst the main body of a snare lives somewhere in the lower mids or upper bass, the attack of the snare, that actual crack sound, often lives somewhere between 1 and 2 kilohertz, which is right in the emphasized upper mid-range of the RE600s V2. And I think that certainly explains why the snares are sounding quite so forwards and a bit harsh in places. Now, moving on to EDM and Polaris by Deadmau5, and I'm really missing the bass. The kick has a decent and quick punch, but it's not especially loud. So whilst there is a good amount of extension, there is a considerable lack of volume and raw power in the bass, which unfortunately doesn't work quite so well for EDM. But I do have to give the RE600s some credit for the clarity and detail available, but it just lacks that energy and excitement required for that genre. Now, at this point, I need to circle back round to the tips and talk about those and how much they affect the sound. Now, the supplied tips, much like on the TWS600, are a strange pick and mix of different types. I mean, let's just take a look at it. We've actually got a bunch of duplicate tips. So this one is a single flange with a bar in the middle of it. And this one is also a single flange with a bar in the middle of it. And it's the exact same size. So we've got 2 pairs of the exact same tip. Then we've got some bi-flange tips. And we've got 3 pairs of this because the ones that came on them originally were the same ones. And then we've got these large biflange tips, and you get 2 pairs of these as well. So there's not a huge amount of variation going on. And to be honest, these tips are not that great. They're a bit flimsy. And because they've been stuffed into this foam, they're actually in places a little bit misshapen. I don't know if you can see this. Yeah, a little bit misshapen. You're also getting a few of these clear silicone tips as well, which are really quite large. An interesting point to note is that the sound is really quite affected by tip fit, especially in relation to insertion depth. As I said, I didn't really get on with most of these tips except for this one dual flange pair. And I did all of my listening for review purposes using these tips because these are the ones that are supplied. However, I've also been using the RE600s with Comply T400 foam tips. And I have to report that my experience using those has been quite different and most welcome. They appear to deaden down some of that upper mid shout a bit and also somewhat elevate, but more importantly, tighten up the bass. And I think the result is a much more well-rounded, but still rather neutral sound. So for example, they actually smoothed off some of that harshness in the snare hits and actually gave that bass a little bit more body and fullness. But I would say that if you are struggling with the tips for the RE600s, or you are thinking about picking a pair of these up, I would highly recommend picking up a pair of foam tips or your favorite other tips to go with them. In conclusion then, the RE600s V2 is certainly a good sounding earphone that would really suit lovers of a more neutral and detailed sound for genres like jazz. But for modern genres, I personally find them lacking somewhat in terms of energy and excitement due to that lean bass. The forward nature of the upper mids is also an acquired taste, and that upper mid emphasis between 1 and 2.5 kilohertz. It does work well for jazz and brings piano, saxophone and vocals to the front of the mix. However, this can also lead to more shouty sounds on other genres. Overall detail and clarity though is rather excellent, which gives the RE600s V2 a more analytical audiophile edge than a casual musical one. And the cable is rather poor, stiff, and microphonic. I would much prefer to see an earhook style design with a removable cable. The supply tips are rather lackluster, and I found the overall experience improves greatly when using aftermarket foam tips. In terms of price, the launch price of the RE600S was very high for what these are, I think. And even now, at £60 or $75, I think there's a lot of competition in the IEM space. Now, if Hifiman could update these with a removable cable, I think they would be a much more compelling option. However, in the RE600S, you're getting a good detailed sounding earphone with a neutral sound signature, and it's £60 or $75. I don't think this is an unreasonable price point considering the performance, especially if you're into jazz. Right, so that's going to be it then. If you like this review, then don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing by hitting the red button down there and maybe the bell right next to it. And if you're looking to support the channel, if you check down in the description, there'll be a bunch of links on how you can do that. I'm going to have a lot more content like this coming out soon, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.